Ready? All right, good morning. My name is Ralph Martire. I'm Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. I also happen to be the Rubloff Professor of Public Policy at Roosevelt University. We're here today to talk about the progress being made and frankly not being made on funding the state's new school funding formula, the evidence-based formula. As everyone knows, this legislation passed into law in August of 2017, and it passed into law with an interesting requirement. The statutory language clearly states, and I'm going to quote now, that the purpose of this section of the legislation is to ensure that by June 30th, 2027 and beyond, this state has a kindergarten through grade 12 public education system with the capacity to ensure the educational development of all persons to the limits of their capacities in accordance with the Constitution. All right. The problem with that is it requires full funding on an inflation-adjusted basis within 10 years from when the legislation passed. At our current rate of funding, we absolutely will not get to fully funding this bill until the year 2051, over 30 years from now. Now, the legislation does have a minimum funding requirement in them. At least $300 million a year has to go in over and above the prior year. That amount could go up to $350 if the property tax relief fund isn't drawn upon. But that said, even if that full $350 goes in, it's a 31-year period between now and full funding of this act. That leaves generations of students in underfunded schools. So, as this next poster board shows, if we wanted the funding to be done within 10 years, we'd have to almost more than double the amount of money that's going in over and above the prior year's funding level. We'd have to go up from a $350 million level to $779 million a year. And that would get us funded, fully funded, in 10 years from now, and kind of meet the statutory requirements. We really should find a way to get this additional money into the legislation. And the reason I'm saying that is if you look at the breakdown of the school districts in Illinois today, what you will see is that the vast majority of them, 83%, don't have adequate resources to fund an education for their students. Right. 707 of our school districts have less than what the evidence indicates they need to provide an adequate education to their students. And the way this new school funding formula works is that it identifies a unique adequacy target of money every school district needs to provide the level of education the evidence indicates is required for the students that school district serves to succeed academically. So it automatically adjusts for that school district's population, whether low income, special needs, English language learners, et cetera, and it funds those evidence-based practices that actually enhance student achievement. 707 of our school districts lack adequate funding today, and as I indicated previously, it'll take over 30 years to fully fund the evidence-based formula at our current level of putting in just $300 to $350 million a year every year in new money. I thought I'd break down, and this chart shows graphically, the gap in funding per student faced by different races of students in our state. So now you know 707 of our school districts lack adequate capacity to fund a quality education based on the evidence. So what is the funding gap faced by every student in this state that attends an underfunded school by race? Here the data are compelling. White students that are in an underfunded school face a funding gap of over $3,300 per student. African American kids, $4,600 less in funding per student in their underfunded schools. Latino kids, $4,800 less per student in their underfunded schools, and the statewide average is over $4,000 per student. That's significant. And we now know how inequitable the old school funding formula was. We could see these dramatic gaps by race in funding. And we know that we can fill the gaps in a manner the evidence indicates will actually work to help our children succeed academically. And we know that the new school funding formula and the distribution model that it has created will equitably fill these gaps rapidly if we devote adequate resources to funding it. How do we know that? We have 1 full year of distribution that we could model out from the formula. And the way the formula works, it divides school districts into tiers based on how much of the money they need they actually have, how much of their adequacy target is actually funded. Tier 1 schools are the furthest away from having adequate resources. They have 64% or less of the money they need to educate the children they serve. Tier 2 schools are between 64% and 90% funded. Tier 3, between 90% and 100% funded. And Tier 4 actually have more resources today than what the evidence indicates they need. If we look at how that first $366 million got distributed, and it's shown right here, 89% of the new money, over $326 million, went to those Tier 1 schools. 89%. This is the complete opposite of distribution that we had under our old formula, which was highly regressive and put more money into the more affluent communities first. Our new formula is working. It is putting the money where the needs are greatest, and it's putting that money in there fastest. Next. Another way to look at how this distribution went, and this is very compelling, is by low income count served by school districts. So what we try to do is isolate school districts by the percentage of low income children they serve, plus the total number of children they serve, to try to get like-kind comparisons across the state. So each one of the divisions you see on this chart educates somewhere between 300,000 and 360,000 children, school districts that educate that number of kids enrolled. CPS is the reason for this comparison, right? They have 369,000 students, and so we wanted to compare school districts with similar student populations. So of that first $366 million in funding that went through the formula, 79% of it went to school districts serving students that were enrolled that had a low income count over 53%. In fact, you could see the funding per student. So those school districts serving low income counts of between 53 and 66% got $255 per student, new funding for their kids. Between 67 and 100% poverty got $489 per student. CPS, which is a significant poverty level, 78%, only got $179 per student. And it's interesting, this legislation was initially attacked as a Chicago bailout. And it's not only not a Chicago bailout, but it equitably distributes this new money. And the reason why CPS gets somewhat less per student than what you would think predicated on its low income count is simple. CPS has higher property values than most low income communities. And that's taken into account by the formula. But 79% of the money is going to school districts that have student populations well over 53% low income counts. The money is going where we want it to go. If you look at the next graphic, it's also hitting those significant gaps in funding faced on a racial basis in our state. So, 79% of the new money that went through the formula in the first year went to school districts that educate 84% of our African American kids and 75% of our Latino kids. And if you remember, the largest gaps in funding per student faced on a racial basis by students attending underfunded schools are the gaps faced by our African American and our Latino kids. Over $4,600 for the black kids, over $4,800 for the Latino kids. The statute is working. It's working well. We can't wait to the year 2051 to fund it. The problem that we have that remains is our state has a structural deficit. I mean, you've heard Governor Pritzker talk about the financial problems the state is facing. They are real. What this model shows you is that with no changes in law from our current situation, the top line is the cost of continuing to provide the same level of services the state provides today into the future, including full funding of the evidence-based formula, adjusted for inflation and population change, assuming a normal economy. It also includes paying our debt. The bottom line, the red line, that's what our revenues will produce. The gap between revenue production and maintaining our investment in current services, paying our current debts, is the structural deficit. With our current fiscal condition, the state can't do a better job of funding K-12 education. But we can't afford to let fiscal shortcomings continue to be a barrier to funding this bill. We now know what the evidence indicates is needed for every student in our state to attend a school that has the resources needed to provide her or him the education they require to succeed academically. We know what it costs based on the evidence. We're underfunding it today by $7.3 billion. The statute itself requires that it be fully funded within 10 years. Our current rate of increasing funding for K-12 education won't get it fully funded for 50 years. So as the budget negotiations go on in Springfield this year, I think we should look at the proposals that the governor has put on the table, frankly, the fair tax, something that raises an additional $3.4 billion in revenue, as something to be strongly considered so that our state can finally make the investment in its students that the evidence indicates it needs to make for every kid to attend a school where they can succeed. So certainly the fair tax is a great starting point. We need other things to fix our fiscal condition. But as the budget negotiations go on this year, I think it's really crucial that our state both consider what it takes to fully fund this evidence-based formula and ensure we have the financial capacity to make that commitment and at least make it within 10 years. Now, I'm honored to be joined at this panel today by Representative Will Davis. Representative Will Davis was one of the lead sponsors on this legislation. Senator Martire was scheduled to be here today. He is stuck in an appropriations hearing that hasn't quite ended yet. But Representative Davis is really one of the primary reasons we actually got this legislation passed. He, along with his colleagues, Senator Martire, Senator Lightford, and Republican State Representative, former Representative Pritchard, really played a key role in getting this legislation passed. And Representative Davis, I'd love you to take the podium and say a few words.
And good afternoon. First of all, let me thank in a very, very special way Ralph Martire and the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability for all of their efforts and the vital role that they played in helping us to get over the finish line with the new formula changes as well. So let's not make sure we acknowledge that effort as well. And there were several other organizations, school-related organizations as well that participated. But I think what we have here is kind of a classic governmental situation where we have done something great. And we know we needed to move in the direction. The way we had been funding schools was just not getting us where we needed to be overall with regard to student outcomes. So we put something in place that's special, that's great, that acknowledges the shortcomings of what we've been doing, but puts us on a path to getting toward where we need to in terms of making sure that our young people, who we all claim are our future, have the resources in their respective school districts to get them to a point where we are making sure that they have significant outcomes and that we are wanting them to be those productive citizens. But the interesting part about this is that unfortunately it costs money in order to get there. But nevertheless, reports show, many reports done by the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability show that making the right investment in our young people certainly gets us to where we need to go with regard to outcomes and where we want to move overall as the state of Illinois. But unfortunately, it takes those resources. And while we put in legislation the idea of getting there in 10 years, the stats and the data has shown that unfortunately, at the rate we are going, that we won't get there in 10 years. So Illinois has a unique decision to make with regard to that. And we understand, we're happy to have a new governor, and that governor is trying to kind of right the wrongs of the last 4 years in a lot of different ways. But the question is, what do we believe? And I think the answer to that question is we believe that by fully funding this formula, that we give our young people here in the state of Illinois the best opportunity to be that productive citizen that we desire. That's what we believe. But we have to make the commitment to make sure that the resources are there. And yes, if we continue at the rate we're going, yes, we're going to continue to put new money into the formula, and great things are going to happen over time. But if we really want to fulfill the obligation that we set forth in the legislation, which is a 10-year window or 10-year opportunity, then we have to make those kind of difficult decisions to commit the resources necessary to get us there. And while we're talking about a lot of different revenue sources, even in the governor's introduced education budget, he wants to continue the effort to put more new money into the funding formula, and that's great. But again, as we've shown and as the data illustrates, that's going to take us a considerable amount of time. And so again, while we're happy with what we've done, it's important of us to really have a real conversation about the resources to get there. And I'm fortunate enough not only to have been the House sponsor of the funding bill, but as a member of the House Democratic leadership team, I'm also part of the budgetary discussions as well. And so I will be advocating to the best of my ability, making sure that we put enough resources into the formula. Now, again, because we want to do so many things that we've never been able to do in the last 4 years, money is going to go in a lot of different ways, or at least it's proposed to go in a lot of different ways. But again, what's our real priority? And we feel that our real priority has to be the children in the state of Illinois. Because again, we always talk about children being the future. Well, we've shown that in order for them to have success at being that future, that we have to fund the formula not only just appropriately as is indicated, but we have to add some extraordinary dollars to the funding formula to give us that opportunity. So I think what you've heard here is just a case being made why we need to do what we need to do, and we hope to be able to appeal not only to a number of legislators, but also to appeal to the governor's office that this is definitely the right thing to do in the direction that we need to be moving in, again, to make sure that our young people here in the state of Illinois have the best opportunity to be productive and to move on to greater and better things. So again, thank you to Ralph and the Center for just, again, laying out the case, but again, just acknowledging all the hard work that they have put into, and the meetings that they participated in, and the data that they've provided, and the modeling that they've done to show us, you know, how successful we can be. But now we have to take that and run with it, and that's what we hope to be able to do in this upcoming budget year.
Questions?
I don't think you mean 4 years, do you, Representative Davis? I don't think the situation was all that great under Governor Quinn, Governor Blagojevich.
Well, think about those previous governors just continued the bad system that we were using, that did not acknowledge the differences in our school districts. It was all they were all just kind of the same in that respect, and we know that not all school districts are created equal for a variety of reasons. So we know under those governors, we just perpetuated, a system. Now, we were able to move a bill forward that really changed that. And again, this was a great effort that began out of something called Vision 2020 that evolved from there with the help of organizations like the Center into the funding model that we have today, that not only acknowledges the need for more resources, but actually, using evidence shows how if we put resources in the right places, that we should expect better outcomes from our young people. And again, a couple of unique pieces of it are, A, setting the unique adequacy targets of the school districts. Again, that shows you that not all school districts are created equal, and we know that some need more resources than others. And then a unique distribution model as well that recognizes that those that are furthest behind are the ones that we need to put at the front of the line to make sure that they get the resources first. And for me, you know, that is what's necessary to lift everyone up as well. And that's the argument that I continue to make when I speak to the various school groups, the Alliance, school administrators, school principals, school boards, you name it. When I speak to them, I'm trying to continually make that case so that we can get past any of the competitive aspects that we went through before and just recognize that our collective responsibility as legislators, as educators, as advocates is to make sure that every child has the opportunity to succeed. And we have to continue to believe that, and we have to continue to work toward it. So even under the previous governor, I'll just say there was some recognition that that is what needed to happen as well. And so we were able to not only get it passed, which wound up being a bipartisan effort, but then he also signed it. And then in year 2, he continued to fund it, you know, which is what we needed. But now we're past that administration, we're with the new administration, and there's a new ask of the administration. And that administration needs to recognize the idea that we've got to pump more money than just what we started doing into the formula to get us there a lot quicker.
Well, we heard about the graduated tax as one possibility, but that's not going to solve it all by itself, even if it passes, is it?
Well, it's a step in the right direction, you know, if we committed that, you know, that level of resource into the formula overall. And again, that's not the only type of revenue resource we're looking at as well. So it may need to be a combination of things. And again, I can't in good conscience suggest that this is the only thing that we need to put money toward as we look toward the upcoming budget. It's not the only thing, but it's an important thing. But again, we know that you've got to make the investment on the front end, and that investment on the front end helps saves us money on the back end because we're not putting as much money into, you know, the need for all of the social service programs that we need to fund. We may be working towards reducing the prison population, so which means we're not going to be investing all of the money that we're doing now in our correction system. And you can point to that in a lot of different ways in state government, but you just got to make that first step. Now, we've made the first step, but we know that now a bigger step needs to be made to help get us to where we're going.
Yeah, I want to supplement that answer by Will, because Representative Davis is spot on in everything he said. So the governor's proposal on what he's calling the fair tax is a very needed and very important first step. But that's what it is. It's a needed and important first step. Yeah, it's good tax policy. It's textbook definition of fair taxation. If you pick up a textbook on how you're supposed to design a tax system in a modern economy, you need to have your income tax track ability to pay. Well, guess what? What we know is from 1979 to 2015 here in Illinois, the wealthiest 1% saw their incomes grow after inflation by 179%, whereas the bottom 99% only saw a growth of 9%. Your tax system can't recognize that unless it has a graduated rate structure that imposes a higher rate at the top than the bottom and middle. That's precisely what the governor is proposing to do. It's sound tax policy. It responds to the economy. Does it solve all the state's fiscal problems? No. I don't think I ever heard Governor Pritzker claim that it did. There are other things we need to look at. We need to look at our sales tax base. We need to look at the pension ramp that currently exists for repaying the debt borrowed from the pension systems, and we need to fix that in a rational way. But if we do a couple of these things, we will completely eliminate that structural deficit. What we are saying here at the center is it's crucial we start making these needed long-term fiscal structural reforms, or we cannot fund fully the evidence-based formula, and that will continue to shortchange the education for millions of children in our state, number one. And number two, it will allow us to continue falling behind other states in educating our kids. When the evidence is telling us what it costs, and when we can determine how much of an investment we would need to make annually to actually satisfy the statutory requirement that we funded in 10 years. So we think that needs to be brought into the conversation, as this is why we need to reform our fiscal system. This is why we got to take those structural steps. So yeah, the Governor Pritzker's fair tax is just a first step there. I mean, you got to look at what we've done to higher education. Representative Davis, I've heard you talk about higher education and the needs there. The truth is, We are putting less in nominal dollars into higher education today in our 2019 fiscal year than we did in the year 2000 by some $400 million. Once you adjust for inflation, we've actually reduced our investment in higher education by 52% over that sequence. Is it any wonder why our tuition rates are growing at much faster rates than the rest of the nations for our public institutions? No, it's not. So all these discussions have to be part of what goes into crafting the solutions to the state's fiscal system, because people talk as if it operates in a vacuum. It doesn't operate in a vacuum. If you have inadequate capacity from a resource standpoint on the front end, you will get inadequate outcomes on the back end. And in this case, inadequate outcomes for our K-12 children is something we should not tolerate anymore, now that we have a formula that's based on the evidence and tells us what we really need for all our kids to have the kind of education where they can all succeed. We need to make that investment.
In the upcoming budget year, are you going to be satisfied with the $350 million or whatever it is, or are you going to want that 770 number negotiated to this budget?
You know, from the center standpoint, the sooner we can get to increasing the investment above where it currently is, the better. But we also recognize there are constraints. And even if the governor is able to get his fair tax passed into law, we won't be seeing revenue from that for 18 to 24 months. And this state certainly is in a position right now where it could cut spending on other services to invest in K-12. That would make no sense. We are horribly underfunding human services. We are not adequately funding public safety. We're barely adequately funding health care, and we are certainly underfunding higher ed, early childhood, and K-12. By the way, that's where 95% of the state's money goes, is to all those items. So, you know, the current budget year may be difficult to do. What we are saying is the legislature needs to sit down with the governor, and they need to agree on the reforms that it will take to build the fiscal capacity so we could start making these rational investments. The sooner the better. By next fiscal year would be wonderful. If they could do a little bit more this fiscal year with some short-term temporary revenue increases or some of the other revenue increases Governor Pritzker put on the table. He put about $840 million in potential revenue increases for this year on the table. You know, those should be seriously considered. And the reason they should be seriously considered is the state literally lacks the capacity to continue providing the same level of services it provides today into the future, and the level of services it provides today are inadequate to meet demographically driven demand across the board.
So you've been saying that this new system is that much better than the previous one, but at the current rate that it's being funded, what's the difference? Is it still that much better than?
Yeah, because as you saw how the money went, so under the old system, when new money was put in, it really didn't go to those neediest districts sort of first and foremost. It was regressive in how it allocated resources. The distribution of the new money matters, right? I think it's powerful that the vast majority of this money going into the system, 89% of it, went to those tier 1 districts that had the least resources according to what the evidence indicated. 89%. You saw that over 70% of the new resources going to schools that are educating, you know, over 80% of our African American kids and over 70% of our Latino kids. These are the kids facing the largest gaps in funding per student in underfunding schools. So we've got a formula that absolutely works, and the data show it work. Now we need to make the investment in it, and our current fiscal condition won't allow that investment. That's why the budget discussions have to be more than about this year. It has to be about building the fiscal capacity of our state to make adequate investments in things like the evidence-based formula.
And also, just in the overall attitude, or how can I say it, just feeling of our school districts is making education better, because now our school districts feel a level of certainty. Because the way the formula works is that when you get new money, it becomes part of your base. And that's guaranteed that you'll get at least that much continuing. So it helps them to plan, helps them to make better decisions, and it just makes them feel good about what they want to be able to do for their students. Where before, you know, they were making decisions because they didn't know what the certainty was moving forward. And then if they made a decision, then they'd have to walk backwards from that to try to restore it or to try to put it back in place. But now they have a level of certainty that they like, that they appreciate, and it's giving them the opportunity to even be a little creative with the types of offerings that they want to provide for their students, other than just making sure that they've got good teachers, that they've got teachers in the classrooms, and that those classrooms are going to function appropriately. But, you know, now they're thinking about, what can I add? You know, what's my value add to that as well? Maybe I'll offer some robotics, some STEM-related things, making sure that for my students that need the extra help, that they can put the extra reading and math in place, and it be certain, so that the students know and the administration knows that it's going to be there, and that they're going to be able to provide that extra help for their students. So it's giving them a lot of certainty, which I think is just helping with the overall attitude and feeling about what we're doing here in Springfield.
And it might be, I might have it lost in here in one of these charts that I might miss, but one of these tier 1 schools that, if this program were to get fully funded, or the difference between fully funded and now, how much are they a tier 1 school district?
It will, you know, that'll depend on the
Yeah.
tier 1 school district, right? But there will be no more tier 1 school districts. Every school district will be at or above adequacy. Every school district will be tier 3 or tier 4. And so the money will, then new money after that will literally be predicated on changes in student population and enrollment and keeping pace with inflation, right? So once we get there, the cost of maintaining being there is really going to be a minimal charge to the state's budget going forward. But the challenge is getting there.
Do you have any numbers on if any district have moved up a tier since this began, or?
No, because that data hasn't been published by ISB yet, but we will look when the next publication comes out. We will be able to determine that from the report card when that next one comes out. And I have to say, you know, not only do I mean, Representative Davis, your comments were kind. We wouldn't have this legislation but for Representative Davis's work. I watched those negotiations, Representative Davis, so I knew what was going on. But I have to say, a lot of school districts in Illinois, 67% of them are deficit spending, 67%. So this new funding, in some cases, is not going to the evidence-based practices, not because districts don't want to, but because, frankly, they got to backfill holes in funding from the state's old horrible formula. We have so many inequities to overcome from that old formula that it's really incumbent on us to fund this faster than the current pace. That is the only way to ensure children will get the benefit of the implementation of these evidence-based practices. And what's great about the legislation, as opposed to any other kind of school funding formula, those practices that work are each identified in the legislation. You can look it up. You could see tier 2 interventionists, they're there. Professional development, that's there. You know, nurses, guidance counselors, that's there. Social workers, that's there. You know, things for special needs programming, technology. All these evidence-based practices that have been tied to enhancing student achievement over time are literally identified in the statute. So it's a powerful statute for stakeholders, because they could start looking at how their districts are applying money, new money, to see if it's going to evidence-based practices, or if they're just backfilling some of that old debt, which of course they're going to have to do to get rid of that debt. But the bottom line is this is a powerful piece of legislation from a transparency standpoint, an accountability standpoint, an equity standpoint. It just needs funded.
And finally, you know, having been a part of a fellowship program for the last almost year and a half through the National Conference of State Legislators, Illinois has now propelled itself to one of the leaders in this effort compared to other states that are still trying to figure a lot of things out. We talk a lot about Massachusetts as being one of the best, and Illinois is right up there with Massachusetts because of the efforts of the center, other groups, and my colleagues that were mentioned earlier, Senator Menard, Senator Lightfoot, and former Representative Bob Pritchard as well. So we are now talked about in a different way. And when I go to these meetings of the fellowship group, Illinois is now one of the more contributing states to the overall conversation about what we've done, what we've been able to accomplish, and what it took for us to get there. So we're very proud of that.
Yeah, we've gone from being the before picture to the after. Great. Any more questions? Great. Then thank you very much for attending. Appreciate it.
Our officers.
Jeff Berkowitz, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel. We're going to take a bit of an in-depth look at the run for the mayor of Chicago. I think what they care about is the issues we're talking about. What are you going to do about the schools? What are you going to do about fixing the financial situation of the city? And what are you going to do about the level of crime and ensuring that we have safe neighborhoods? Would I be right on that?
Yes.
The Illinois Channel, keeping you connected to your state, your issues, your home.